Well, that was former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney eulogizing his friend, former U.S. President George H.W. Bush, at the 41st President of the United States funeral service today in Washington. Andrew Cohen is a journalist and author, and he is with me now. It's good to see you again. Thanks for coming in to talk to me about what we saw today. Let's start with the relationship between George H.W. Bush and Brian Mulroney. Why were those two leaders so close?
They seem to be intellectually, temperamentally aligned. They seem to have this chemistry. I don't think I've seen that in any relationship between a president of the United States and a prime minister of Canada. An affection that endures far beyond your time in office. You know, longer people have been in office. I mean, Mackenzie King and Franklin Roosevelt were in office together a long time, but they weren't close. And we have lots of relationships, John F. Kennedy and Lester Pearson, Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau, Bill Clinton and Jean Chrétien, which were close. But to survive outside of office, I think reflected perhaps the times in which they lived, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Brian Mulroney's interest in being an international leader, George Bush's obligation to be an international leader. And I think they both believed in personal diplomacy. They both have a sense of honor about them in public service, loyalty. Their virtues are old-fashioned.
They seem to have, Brian Mulroney touched on it today. First of all, he talked about the vacations they took together, and as you pointed out, really close after office. They seem to have a sense of understanding of what each other's country could do for the other, and not just as leaders, but the role that each of them played on the international stage as Canada and the United States in a sometimes turbulent world.
Well, there were 15 years difference between there were 15 years difference between Brian Mulroney and George H.W. Bush, and there was a point at which George Bush called Brian Mulroney his younger brother. So while Brian Mulroney may have been 15 years his junior, he never treated Canada as a junior partner.
Right.
He would have been, and I'm sure was, appalled by the way Canada was treated by Donald Trump. There was a sense coming from George H.W. Bush, having been at the United Nations, having been in China as a diplomat, having been vice president, that Canada actually mattered and you could do things together. So in the free trade negotiation, remember, they forged this landmark agreement together. Out of respect. They fight acid rain together. And then internationally, Brian Mulroney is actually useful to George H.W. Bush. When George H.W. Bush is putting together the coalition in the Persian Gulf, it's Brian Mulroney who says, speak to Mitterrand, François Mitterrand, France, before you call Margaret Thatcher in Britain, because Mitterrand will appreciate that.
Right.
And Brian Mulroney facilitates that. He calls François Mitterrand. There are all kinds of small acts of grace demonstrated by both men, understanding that they could do things together, which was the old way of seeing Canada. Canada, yes, was a junior partner in terms of size and population, but not in terms of its diplomacy and what it could do if it was focused.
What did we get from George Bush in return? We talked a little bit about, and he did elevate sort of Canada's role in the conversation globally, but we saw something we haven't seen in this country before. We have the flags are flying on federal buildings in this country today, and on any Canadian buildings in the United States at half-mast as a tribute to George H.W. Bush. Don't think we've ever seen it before. What does that say?
And I'm not so sure it was recognized while the two were in office, but you said, what did we get out of it? Brian Mulroney made acid rain the ballot, and we hardly even talk about acid rain anymore, but you and I have been around.
We grew up talking about it a lot.
We did, and when Ronald Reagan was here, there were demonstrations right out here on Parliament Hill. Brian Mulroney said, this is a acid test, so to speak, of our relationship. So you have to do that.
I need this from you.
I need this from you, and he got it. At the same time, free trade was done. Yes, I mean, the United States is not a pushover, and it wasn't going to sacrifice its interests to please Canada. It was not an act of philanthropy on the part of the United States. But there was a fairness about it, a dispute settlement mechanism, a sense that we're not going to push you with tariffs, we're not going to threaten you, and we certainly are not going to use the language that we have now seen in the renegotiation of NAFTA. That simply wasn't George Bush's style. And Brian Mulroney understood, whether it was his caucus, and you were there and knew how he understood the diplomacy of politics, and he understood that relationships matter, and so did George Bush, and I think that is what anchored them. I mean, they weren't of the same, they were 15 years different, so they weren't of the same generation. We heard Brian Mulroney say today, you know, when I was 20, I was working a part-time job, I think up in Hudson's Bay. When George Bush was 20, he was being shot down over the South Pacific. So it was a different world.
Let's finish. I mean, clearly this is what happens at a time of funerals. I suppose if I had to paraphrase everything we heard today in the funeral service, he's remembered as an utterly decent man today, but he wasn't without flaws, and tell me about that.
Well, he gave us Dan Quayle, who was an inadequate vice president. He nominated Clarence Thomas, who had credible sexual allegations, to the Supreme Court of the United States. He certainly ran an unflattering, hard-edged campaign against Michael Dukakis. He destroyed Michael Dukakis. And interestingly, when it was said today that those flaws, in a way, were acknowledged today when he said to preside, you have to prevail. He wasn't without ambition. There were things he didn't do. I think he was deaf on the racial question. But on the whole, history, the United States, Americans are infinitely, when they're talking about their president, they're sentimental. Right. And so the lionization that did not happen in the life of George H.W. Bush is now happening in death. And the funeral was the first step. And Americans are always revisiting their presidents. Herbert Hoover, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, all are always being revisited, and usually favorably, because Americans have this sense of nostalgia.
Andrew Cohen, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.